In September 2021 in Killamarsh, Derbyshire, two young children, their friend and their mother, were brutally murdered in the place they should have been safest, their own house. A subsequent investigation uncovered catastrophic failings by the probation service, failings that had deadly consequences. This is what happens when a drug-abusing, violent predator enters the world of a happy family. This is the case of mass murderer Damien Bendel. Hi and welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. If you're new here, I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. Crime and consistency is a bit of a catchphrase for me, so if you like deep dives and you like knowing the kind of content you're gonna get served regularly, then this is the channel for you. Go on, subscribe. Or at least after you've watched it, if you like it, get that notification button on and subscribe. Also, thanks for all your likes. Thank you so much to my Patreon and my YouTube membership subs. Without you guys, couldn't do it. Simple as that. So let's get on with today's case. It is absolutely horrific. It's one that when I heard about it, when the actual killings took place, I was transfixed. I had so many questions that just couldn't be answered at that moment in time. So I've waited until it's gone to court so that I could give you the full story and also do my deep dive. So let me take you back in time, but not very long ago. We're talking September 2021. And at this point, we have 35-year-old Terry Harris. She's living in a semi-detached home on Chandos Crescent in Killamarsh, which is in Derbyshire, lovely part of the world. And she's got two children that live with her. So she's got her 13-year-old son, John Paul, and she's got 11-year-old Lacey. Now, both of those children were pupils at Outwood Academy City in Sheffield. And you know what? When you've got kids, they're not always close, are they? 11 and 13 can be an awkward time, awkward chronology, often lots of squabbles, but it wasn't the case where Lacey and John Paul were concerned. The siblings were incredibly close. Also, it's known when we look at the personalities of these children that Lacey was a really loving child. She was very caring, she was very compassionate, but she was also a natural born performer. So there was a level of extroversion to her personality. She enjoyed making TikToks, she enjoyed dancing, she just enjoyed basically celebrating life. Now, the family described John Paul as more reserved, so a more sensitive child, a very thoughtful child, and was an individual that would never, ever think of even hurting a fly. So descriptors there of two thoroughly lovely children. And Terry, what can we say about Terry as a mother? She was absolutely devoted. People say she lived for her two children. And I think that if you're a parent, you can own that phrase, because if you're a loving parent, that is indeed how you feel. That whatever your children require, you want to devote yourselves to achieving that for them, and their lives are just existentially and hugely more important as far as you're concerned than your life. And Terry mirrored the description that I've just given of how so many of us parents feel. She worked as a healthcare assistant in a nursing home, so we see somebody who's got compassion running through her core. She had separated from the kid's dad, Jason Bennett, and they'd been together for a long time though. There was 14 years that they spent together. So they obviously had a relatively successful relationship. And I do want to say at this point, because we're always pointing out negatives in parents, that when you look at Terry and Jason, even though they were separated, Jason was an incredibly devoted father. He made a big effort to see his children, so he saw John Paul and Lacey regularly. And he also messaged them or spoke to them every single day. So even though they're separated, there's this real unification over the care and love that they have for their children. And clearly, when we want to think about fractures in children's lives, it's actions of such parents who sacrifice their own needs to ensure that the children are entitled to a relationship with both parties and are allowed to enjoy and celebrate and thrive within their relationships. And in this case, that's exactly what the parents were doing. Now, the family had only been living in the actual area I talked about earlier for a few months, so they'd moved from Sheffield. Terry at this point was also in the very early stages of pregnancy at the time, and she was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. The boyfriend that we're talking about in question was 31-year-old Damien Bendel. He also was living with her and the children, and he'd followed them when they'd moved from Sheffield. So he'd actually followed them to that move and then started living with them. Terry and Bendel, how did they meet? Well, you know, with respect, they met in one of the most popular ways that you can meet these days, on an online dating site. They met around 18 months earlier, so that would have been April 2020. I know, this is the modern era of dating. I appreciate that lots of people meet on dating sites. I'm not trying to deride dating sites. I'm just saying, it can lull you into a false sense of security when you meet somebody online. There's a lot of masking. I don't necessarily think that the people who present themselves in profiles are always being honest. And certainly when you look at things like catfishing and love conning, these are problematic online. That noted, it's what people do. So this is how they connect. And he subsequently moved from where he lived in Swindon, Wiltshire, which is a long way away from Sheffield, which is where he inevitably ended up because of this relationship. So he makes this move to be with her. And I imagine for Terry, that's a real admission of care and commitment, of a desire to potentially make this relationship into a relationship that's very long term. Because if somebody's willing to leave their home and their familiar area to come and be with you, well, that makes you potentially think that they must think a great deal of you. It's not often we would think to ourselves, well, maybe the reason that they want to come here is to escape where they live. Maybe things haven't worked out there. Maybe they're looking for a turning over a new leaf scenario, or maybe they're running. There are all these potentials, but that's not how we interpret it. When we're falling in love with somebody and they show commitment and intent to be with us, we think about it in a positive context. Now, what was Bendel like? Well, what we know about him that I'll talk about at this point is that he had a violent past. He had a string, to be fair, of criminal convictions. So he'd been charged with robbery in Swindon in 2011. He'd served 3 years for that. He'd also been charged with attempted robbery and possessing a knife in Swindon in 2015. He got 3 years for that. Also inflicting grievous bodily harm and 2 offences of assault, occasioning actual bodily harm in Plymouth. Now for that, he was given a 54 months prison sentence. And by the time that we actually arrive at September 2021, he's also on a 2-year suspended sentence for arson. He's actually wearing an electronic tag. The reason for that is he set fire to a car that he'd been trying to steal. Now, those offences should not be taken lightly. We're seeing a lot of violence in them. We're seeing repeated offences. We're seeing low consequential connections. So he's going to prison for periods of time. It's not really shifting and changing the way that he acts. And he's on an electronic tag because they're basically needing to make sure that they know where he is. So Terry's taking on a man with a real history here. And arguably, you have concerns immediately because he's around children, and ideally you don't want violent offenders around children. Equally, so many people believe it's possible to change a bad boy, and they just need to be loved and they need to be accepted, and given the right circumstances and variable and foundations, they can shift the way that their behaviour is. I would say you have to be very, very careful with that kind of attitude, because often those kind of mindsets come from a bias about the good person that you are, believing better of the person that you're with, as opposed to the person who you are with actually being capable of such change. Now, one time in his history, he'd even been a bodybuilder and a cage fighter. So this is a man who courts violence, he enjoys violence, he seeks violence, and he's certainly not afraid of using violence. Another thing about him was he claimed that he had a split personality. And the reason for this is he said he just was sometimes very, very violent, just all out of the blue. There'd be these outbursts. And he had this particular message, which was he'd give people 3 warnings and then he'd say, "You're fucked." So basically, he's very clear that there are consequences to people's actions towards him. And those consequences are, if you cross me 3 times, you're going to know about it. Now, immediately, that challenges the idea of him having a split personality, because if what we're saying is we're completely aware of our outbursts and our capacity to do harm to the point where we're able to contain ourselves for at least 2 of the warnings, and then on the 3rd we lose our mind, that demonstrates that he's completely calculated and quite capable of holding back until he believes that somebody has breached their particular boundary with him. Now, basically what we've talked about there briefly is he's an individual with lots of violent offences, and now he's living in a house with 2 children. Now, Terry's mother, this is Angela Smith, she was really concerned about her daughter's relationship. You know, she'd watched Terry in a long-term marriage. She loved her grandchildren. Her main priority is her daughter and her grandchildren. And she expresses that concern because on a historical level, you're looking at that situation, you're thinking to yourself, statistically, is this guy going to be the kind of guy I want to be hanging around my young and vulnerable grandchildren? Is this somebody I want to be sharing a bed with my daughter? And as a good parent, which clearly Angela Smith is, the answer would be no. But Bendall, of course, assures her that she's got it wrong. He's a changed man. He'd never hurt Terry, he'd never hurt her children. And I suppose we could, to some degree, empathise with the belief, therefore, that Terry and her mother have in him, because the actual violence that I've talked about hasn't been directed towards women and children so far as we know. So giving the benefit of a doubt, because the typology of previous victims and situations doesn't fit the paradigm we're talking about today, is potentially why they let that slide. And it's what Terry wanted. Anybody who's got kids, you know, they're going to make choices that you wouldn't ideally wish them to make. But what are you going to do? Reject and abandon them? Or are you going to accept their decisions and support them? And when things go wrong, ensure that you are there to pick up the pieces. And clearly, Terry's mum feels that she wants to take that route, to trust that her daughter knows what she's doing, and to trust that in the long term, things will work out, whatever happens. Now, Bendall, I would say, if you were to imagine a chameleon of such high manipulative grade who's managed to insert himself in this family, is demonstrative of that malevolent mindset and personality, because he does it effectively. But Bendall is going to prove to be far from the ideal partner. And I mean as far from the ideal partner as I could ever try to describe. A complete juxtaposition. So first of all, we know about his criminal background, not ideal, but also he's a drug abuser, and he goes mainly for cocaine and cannabis, but also he does occasionally take morphine and meth. This is somebody who mixes drugs, somebody who has a dependency level on drugs, and somebody who binges on drugs, and that's deeply problematic, particularly when you're around children per se. Also, when he'd been in prison, he regularly took spice. For those of you who aren't in the UK and you don't necessarily know what spice is, it's an affliction on our streets, in particular with homeless people, because it totally zones people out. In fact, you can see somebody who's taken spice on the streets in the freezing cold, and they'll be in a t-shirt and they'll be catatonic. They just won't move. They'll be in these odd, distorted positions. It's like it steals your soul for a period of time, but it also means that you are taken away from the position that you're in and the things that you're having to deal with in that moment. But he's got into that in prison. So again, what are we seeing? We're seeing an individual who often wants to change his mindset and doesn't really care the impact of that mindset. And consequentially, he's taking this in prison. So again, another reinforcer. This guy is not concerned about rules and regulations. He does what he wants when he wants. And he'd also in the past been a heroin dependent. Now, according to Terry's family, they say that this kind of personality that came into Terry's life, where she's obviously hoping that it's going to be a lovely romance that is going to work out effectively for her and her kids, it starts to just deteriorate. And his dependency issues, his actions within the home, it starts to have a really detrimental effect on Terry's well-being. Now remember, Terry is a kind, compassionate, loving woman. She's an individual who's been sold a lie by this man, and now she's ingrained and enmeshed in this relationship, and it's severely problematic for her. And also, Bendel starts to become really controlling, very abusive, and coercive control. We often see this playing out. They love bomb, they convince you that you're the most important person in the world, they'll move a long way to be with you, and then they'll start to isolate you, they'll start to control you, they'll start to eradicate your self-esteem, they'll make you feel small, and they'll threaten you. They'll do anything that they need to keep you and contain you within their control. And Bendel starts doing this. So he starts isolating her from the family. Also, he's jobless at this point. And yet, because Terry is accommodating, and remember, imagine being somebody who's moved this guy, this stranger, into your home. You're going to feel a level of guilt, maybe a level of shame, because you're starting to think to yourself, wow, this is a mistake. But you're feeling that people will be looking at you and saying, well, we told you so. And no one wants that feeling. It's not even that it's a real reality, because families genuinely don't care about that. All they care about is you being safe and well. But it can mean that it tempers your behaviour. You're like, I'll just give it a little bit longer. I'll just try a little bit harder, because you don't want to seem as if you've made this big mistake. I wish that people would just be like, okay with making those mistakes. I wish people would just think to themselves at the first sign of trouble, screw this, kick them out, go back to Swindon, etc. But obviously he's using this manipulation, he's coercing her into this situation, and now he starts to actually get money from her. So he's making her fund his drug habit and his dysfunctional lifestyle, which would have been horrific for her, because this is not Terry's world. And it's the level of entitlement that this absolute loser is also feeling that he has a right to in this relationship. So he's not just taking her money from her wages that are really there to treat her children effectively and look after herself. No, that's not enough to just take from her in this way. As far as I'm concerned, that's stealing, because he's manipulating her to do that, making her feel bad so she has to do that, or threatening her so she has to do that. But he goes so far as to sell her belongings. He even sells her laptop, which everyone will know technologically, your laptop doesn't just have emails on it. It doesn't just have a few notes. It often has loads of pictures. It has information that's really important to you that's stored on it. And he's quite happy to disrespect her in that way. And even though Terry's dealing with all of this, it seems that she's quite smitten. So because she has these really strong feelings towards him, and because she's being manipulated, remember that. Even though the reports are that Terry was somebody that was just massively in love with him and wanted to settle down with him, there are a few things that we can explore there. Number one, that's not because she's stupid. It's because she's trying to see the best in him and believing in better. Bear in mind, these creatures love bomb their partners initially. Their whole game is to make that person see them in the best light possible. And when that light dims and dims and dims and dims, the person who's fallen in love with them wants to keep returning back to how beautiful they were in the beginning. And they think, well, maybe if I just change this, or maybe if I just do this, or maybe if I just try harder here, or maybe if they give them money here, it will all be okay. Because they're trying to return to the origin, not realizing that the origin was only ever a mask. So she's still working at this relationship. And while she doesn't at this point understand that she's so controlled, because she won't, she'll just believe that she needs to work harder and do better. That's how this kind of control level works. She feels this sense of commitment to him. I mean, it's genuinely a downfall, and it says something really wonderful about a woman who can love in spite of, but it makes her incredibly vulnerable. So her family are concerned, her friends are concerned, and they used to refer to Bendel as a wannabe gangster. And the reason that they referred to him that way was because he styled himself as a football thugger, football hooligan, and a neo-Nazi, because he wanted to give that intimidating impression to people that he met. And also he had this desire to just brag about the fact that he'd been in prison. That's really problematic behaviour. Listen, people make big mistakes, right? My ex-husband went to prison. We weren't together, but before we got together, he went to prison. Never went to prison again, then started working in secure units and helping young offenders. There are paths where we see individuals who make horrible mistakes actually not just redeem themselves, but go on to do some pretty incredible work to help others prevent themselves going down similar paths, or at least support them when they're on that path so that they can make a decision to alter it in the future. So I am all for people coming out of prison after being rehabilitated and going on to live very pro-social lives, but you don't go around bragging. In fact, if you are somebody who's actually felt that the system punished you for what you deserved, you will often, and rightly so, feel a level of shame, because you realise that you caused another person pain, or you did something that was illegal that led to that incarceration. And if you are somebody who wanders around thinking it's a really good thing that you did that because it bolsters your reputation, it shows high levels of immaturity in an emotional way, and on top of that, it means that you've not learnt. And so Bendel is somebody who's spent all that time inside and been convicted of some really heinous offences, and he's proud of them. He's wearing it as a calling card to let everybody know, this is who I am. I'm the kind of person who's been to prison, and I'm proud of going to prison for those violent crimes. Big red flag. I mean, this guy was a real piece of work. He had a Third Reich tattoos on his legs. Also, he had True and Blue tattooed on his knuckles. Now, True and Blue is actually referencing his apparent love of Chelsea Football Club. Yeah, tattooed True and Blue, you know, big fan. Never actually been to watch them play, but, you know, devoted. He even had the team crest tattooed on his chest. You kind of get this feeling that he's creating a caricature of an individual. He's presenting an image, but it's not really who he is. Apparently, according to people who knew him, they said he wanted to emulate a bad boy family member, but apparently he always fell short because the other family member was really far worse than him. Sounds like a really great family. Sounds like a great person to emulate. You know, just look for the worst individual in your family and try to live up to their reputation. But he even failed in doing that with respect. So what we would say about Bendel is that he was psychologically a fantasist, a pathological liar. He was constantly claiming to have connections in London, reckoned he was connected to gangsters in South London, all BS. In fact, rather than being the real deal of the torturer of a gangster, you know, the type of person that you envisage, the craze, etc., the only torturing this guy was doing was to kittens. Yeah, he just really enjoyed torturing helpless animals. Also, he once beat a sick dog to death with a brick. And you know why he did that? Because apparently the owner couldn't afford to take it to the vet. So that was a solution. I don't know who's worse in that situation. I am going to throw it in there that both the owner and Bendel are despicable human beings. Genuinely. How could you allow a person to take a brick to your beautiful animal that's been loyal to you just because it's sick? Absolutely heinous, but very descriptive of the kind of personality that we're talking about right now. Now, even though all of these reports are kind of coming out about the way that he was and the concerns that people had for the relationship that was happening, so we literally have family and friends now being very concerned about this relationship, and it's not just them. Even the neighbours, they had concerns. You know, they weren't close to the family, but they just saw them around quite a lot and thought there's something wrong here. Because they had real reservations about Bendel from the start. According to the people who lived close to them, he'd basically stare straight through them. So there's that sense of arrogance, but also I feel like it's that level of threat, isn't it? It's the potential. When somebody's staring through you, they're not concerned about the impact it's having on you. They're not necessarily even seeing you, but they're letting you know that there's a message within the way that they're treating you. You're not being registered, but they're not afraid of you. And that always makes people feel, when they're the individual being stared through, that maybe the individual who's doing it has got some intent towards them. Also, they said, and this is really heartbreaking, that when they saw Terry, she often came across as scared. So they're noting that in her body language and the way that she's acting, she doesn't seem confident. She seems obviously an individual who may be in fear. So with that background, we get to Saturday, the 18th of September 2021. And on that day, we've got a friend of Lacey's, 11-year-old Connie Gent. She's staying with Terry for a sleepover because she's with her best friend. Now, Lacey and Connie went to the same school. And even earlier that day, just because I want to hit home with the kind of amazing children that Terry was raising, Lacey and Connie, as mates, they'd been raising money for cancer research charity. They'd actually decided to do that after meeting a local supermarket worker who'd been diagnosed with cancer. Now that in itself just shows you the kind of child that Lacey was. And because Terry worked in the care industry, she'd also actively raised money for cancer charities. So it's almost like her daughter was looking at her mother's mentorship and following in those footsteps. So these two really good friends had really invested in raising this money. They'd drawn posters, they'd put flyers in the park, they'd raided Terry's kitchen cupboards for sweets and biscuits, and they were actually photographed outside with a stall that they'd set up. And no one could have imagined it would be the last photo taken of them alive. It reminds me of Holly and Jessica in the Sower murders, when they're there in their football shirts. No one imagining that that would be the last picture ever taken of them. And similarly in this situation, Connie and Lacey just doing this incredible thing, being pro-social, being kids, smiling into the camera, not knowing that that would be the last picture that anyone who loved them would see of them alive again. Now, Terry actually texted Lacey and said, you need to be home by 8 p.m. And so Lacey and Connie, they did get home at that stipulated time. They were safe and sound. Again, we're seeing a family that knows how to act. Mother's asking children to come home. The kids are coming home. Even the friend is happy to abide by those rules. And the whole premise is because her mum wants them safe. But no one could have known that they were literally returning to the most unsafe place that they could have ever have imagined. Even in their wildest nightmares, what played out is incomprehensible. Connie, her friend, Lacey's really close mate, she'd been there the previous night as well. And so they'd been having such a good time that she'd been given permission by her parents to stay a second night. And that decision is going to be a decision that's going to haunt them for the rest of their lives. They'll regret that decision for the rest of their lives. Shortly after the kids arrived home, Bendel begins trying to contact his drug dealer because all he's thinking about is cocaine. And apparently he'd spent the day smoking cannabis and being a general waste of space. Then he proceeded to add crack cocaine and alcohol into the mix. And later that night, fueled by drugs, as far as I'm concerned, his true nature was revealed. The following day, this is Sunday the 19th of September 2021, the police get called to the property. Now this is following reports of safety concerns. What had happened is they'd received a call from Bendel's mother and she'd spoken to her son earlier that morning and he'd actually told her that he'd suffered multiple stab wounds, which he'd inflicted on himself. Now, of course, as a mother, you're going to be really concerned. You're going to be deeply worried about the fact that your son is saying that he's injured himself. So she calls emergency services straight away. She's worried that something terrible has happened to him. And at 7:26 a.m., that's when she makes the call. But as she's doing that with respect, very shortly after, Bendel calls the police. This is on Connie's mobile phone, and it's at 7:38 a.m. And he told the dispatcher this: I just need to report a crime. Basically, I need the police and ambulance now because I've just killed 4 people.
Basically, I need the police and the ambulance and that because I've killed 4 people.
Okay, just hold the line.
bear with me.
When the officers arrive, Bendel meets them outside the property and he asks them for a cigarette. He actually tells the officers he stabbed himself in the chest and the stomach. Now, after showing them the superficial wounds, this is what he says. "I'm not going back to prison again. I've murdered 4 people." It's an interesting dichotomy, that, isn't it? Because, of course, he's going to go back to prison if he's murdered 4 people. But there's that sense of recognition, realisation, and a knowledge that consequences are going to occur for these actions. And you can imagine what the officers are thinking at this moment in time. This guy's, you know, an individual who's bleeding, he's got stab wounds, then he's talking about not going back to prison, then he's saying he's murdered 4 people. This is not going to be in their normal experience as police officers. Murders are fortunately very, very rare. The idea of a mass murder, that's a whole different world to most police officers.
All right, come to me. Mate, have you got anything on you that you shouldn't have?
No, there's no weapons or nothing.
Right.
Do you just want to undo your coat? Have you armed yourself?
Yeah.
You have?
Have you stabbed yourself, mate?
I can see blood on your hands.
Yeah.
Anywhere else?
Just my chest, 4 inches in with a bread knife.
Can we have a look?
And 1 on the stomach. I bled quite.
Right, do you want to
take
yes.
Can we go down
No, just stay there.
I just don't want to be in front of everyone.
Alright, just go on the corner.
Just walking wounded at the minute.
Alright, stand here. Stay here.
Right,
So
we're told, I know what's going to happen to you now, mate.
Well, I know it's going to happen when we go to prison, obviously, again.
Why, what have you done? Have you done something to anyone else?
Yeah.
What have you done?
I've murdered 4 people.
So what he says to them is that he basically conveniently blacked out. So he reckoned that he consumed 3 or 4 bags of cocaine, didn't know why he'd done it, and said it was like he was dealing with an out-of-body experience. So the officers then say to him, "Well, are the family okay?" And he replies, "No, there's 1 in the bathroom, 2 upstairs, and 1 in the bedroom." So it's registering with the police officers now, wait a minute, this guy's talking about actually killing individuals, and also not just killing the individuals, admitting to it in a way where there's no way he's likely to not be telling the truth, and he's even described where we'll find them.
Being calm and compliant, but he's got some stab wounds to his chest. They're not oozing blood, but he's saying that his family are inside and that he believes he has murdered them. Are you alright for me to go in?
So understandably, straight away, Bendel gets handcuffed. An officer stays with him, and then the other officer goes in to search the property. You cannot even begin to comprehend what would have been going through that police officer's head. You're probably hoping to God this is just some horrible fantasy that this person's talking about, and you're going to walk into that particular home and it's not going to be the scene that's running through your mind in horror at the potential. But of course, that's exactly what happens. He's met with a truly horrific sight. So Terry, John Paul and Lacey and her friend Connie, every single one of them is dead. Each of them have been beyond brutally murdered, if I'm honest. Each victim has suffered really severe head wounds. And when I say this, I don't say this lightly or to sensationalise, but this is what they say in the reports. Their skulls had basically been smashed in. There was blood everywhere, including all of the walls. And the body cam footage recorded the officer's reaction. And they said, "Oh, Jesus, there's at least 3 casualties, unresponsive. I think they're all dead. They're all gone, mate. They're all gone." Imagine being the person confronted with that reality. I mean, the idea of seeing somebody who's been murdered is a terrible thing to even conceptualise. We're talking 3 children. 3 children. And that's something that very few of us can wrap our heads around. It's so outside the realms of our expectation. It's the wrong order. There's this innocence and quality to children that death and they do not fit together anytime, let alone murder.
Damien, at 07:47 hours, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. Do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Your arrest is necessary to protect you from harm, to prevent your disappearance, for a prompt and effective investigation. Okay? We're going to get you up, we're going to put you in the back of the van.
They then arrest Bendel on suspicion of attempted murder, and they also have to make sure that his stab wounds, because he's stabbed himself, they need to be treated, so they end up taking him to hospital. I don't know about you. I hope the medics at hospital maybe threw iodine on the wounds, or salt. I mean, salt's a good healer. Smarts a little bit, doesn't it? It's very good for healing. I think we could arguably get away with doing things like that and claim it wasn't about inflicting pain on the individual. Just throwing it out there. When he's questioned after he's taken to the police station, this is what he tells detectives. The whole house is covered in claret. I didn't realise what I did until I walked into my room and saw my missus and my daughter. Bet you don't get 4 murders in Killamarsh. Well, 5, as my missus is having my baby. I do not know if I was the particular investigating officer who has to speak to him about this, if I could have survived without, shall I say, finding a chair and placing it somewhere around his head. I don't know, with a little bit of force. But this is what these investigators have to do. They have to somehow contain their human reaction and deal with these monsters. Even the way he describes the scene covered in claret. You're not in a movie. This isn't some kind of EastEnders episode. We're talking about the brutal murder of children here, and your partner and your unborn child. And you're talking about it being covered in claret. You're talking about the fact that you don't get murders in Killamarsh. You're even totting up the numbers. Oh, maybe it's more than 4, it's 5 because, you know, she was pregnant. How the investigators contain that moment, I don't know. I guess that they're just thinking about the long term and that person potentially never getting out of prison if they do their job well. But it must be traumatic and it must be frustrating as hell, because the natural reaction when somebody is talking about the decimation and desecration of children is to want to do things that are illegal to them. When they do the autopsies, it's even more harrowing. If it can be. It actually is. So the extent of the vicious injuries that the victims had suffered plays out. Terry had been struck at least 9 times around her head and her face with a claw hammer. Imagine the dehumanisation that's taking place there. The way that you decimate the features. This is of somebody that loved him, and that's what he does to her. He smashes her head in with a claw hammer. Now, like her mother, 11-year-old Lacey, she'd also had this blunt force trauma. It caused catastrophic brain injuries. She had defence wounds on her forearms. That means that she was trying to fight. Yes, in vain, but she was trying to fight to protect herself. What a little warrior. To actually try to struggle, to try to survive. And also, on top of those injuries, she'd been strangled, but she'd also been raped. That bastard had murdered her and raped her. She was 11. When they looked at John Paul and Connie's bodies, they'd also suffered this multiple blunt force trauma to the head and face. And just like his little sister, he had defence wounds. So John Paul fought back. He tried to defend himself. It's both incredibly courageous of those children to do that, and I have to hold that courage in the same moment as I hold the horror that those children's lives were snuffed out this way, and they were the last images that they saw, this heinous man, an excuse for a human doing this to them. But my God, I will not let go of the fact that they were little warriors, and the world needs individuals like that within it. They, in spite of their fear and horror, they fought. I've got absolute, utter respect for those kids. Now, let's be honest, Bendel at this point is banged to rights. It's as simple as that. So we know he's admitted to brutally killing Terry and her 2 children and their friend Connie. And he described what had happened to the police on the evening of Saturday the 18th September 2021. And the evidence itself that they were able to piece together indicated that the victims had been killed between 9:42 p.m. and 10 p.m. that night. Neighbours who were around at the time, they actually said that they heard shouting and screaming from the house before everything went quiet. but no one called the police. I don't get it. It's not the neighbour's fault that this played out. I appreciate that. They're innocent. They didn't cause this, but I say the words again and again and again: risk offending, pick up the phone, call the police anonymously, do whatever you need. Don't listen to shouting and screaming from the house and then wait till everything goes quiet and still don't act. If somebody is shouting and screaming, then the chances are something terrible is playing out. There's an altercation that needs meeting and dealing with. And if there is silence, well, you might want to believe that it's all calmed down and everything's fine. But what if actually you're dealing with a group of incapacitated or dying victims? And that's what we were talking about in this case. And yet no one acts, no one calls police. It must have been beyond terrifying for his victims. Because the way that he murdered them was essentially individually. So he went through the property, room by room, systematically executing each victim with a claw hammer, beating around the head, the upper body. They could tell that he had attacked Terry in the main bedroom, John in the bathroom, Connie was attacked in another bedroom, and Lacey was attacked in the living room. Now, like I said, after bludgeoning Lacey with that claw hammer, he carried her into the main bedroom where her mother lay dead. And then he laid the unconscious, dying 11-year-old on that bed and raped her before strangling her. Do you know what is even more malevolent about this excuse for a human being? When he was doing that, he positioned a mirror that he propped on the pillows in such a way so he could watch what he was doing to her. The autopsy later revealed that it was very likely that Lacey had been raped at least twice, including after she was dead. So this is a man who's saying that, you know, he didn't know what had happened, he'd just come round and this horrible stuff had occurred. But no, he had the wherewithal to not just murder this poor child, but then to take her body, to lay it next to her mother, and to absolutely violate her both before and after death. That doesn't show someone out of their mind. That shows someone very much in control of what they're doing, very much aware of what they want to get out of that situation. When the police looked at her body, one of the things that they actually found near it was Bendel's electronic tag and the knife that he'd used to cut it off, because he wasn't finished. He didn't want to get caught. He didn't want the police knowing where he was or where he was going after this. The officers also very quickly found the murder weapon. It was a hammer covered in blood. They also found a used condom. But as I said, there was a period of time after the killings that he didn't inform the police. In fact, sickeningly, hours after the killings, he calls a taxi. At 6 a.m, he isn't thinking about speaking to the police. No, he's thinking about his next hit. So he doesn't just call the taxi after doing this to try to just leave the place and start to come to the acceptance of the heinous human being and murderer that he is. No. That's not on his mind at that moment in time. What's on his mind is getting John Paul's Xbox, which he literally later exchanges for drugs in Sheffield. This is not a man who's out of his mind. This is a man who's fully engaged with a fantasy, and now he wants to get high. There's actually CCTV of him wandering the streets, so they have pictures of him actually walking through the streets, and he's carrying the games console in his carrier bag. And also, it's the way he is with the taxi journey. So understandably, the taxi driver is saying, you know, how's your night been? And he actually said, not too bad, a bit mad. Can you imagine that? Not too bad, a bit mad. I mean, if you talk about the understatement of a century, he's killed his partner and 3 children with a claw hammer. Can you believe that he can even conceive of these conversations in that situation? That he's minimizing and distancing himself and, You describe, oh, it's been a bit of a mad night when, I don't know, you've gone out and found yourself at a nightclub even though you really weren't meant to be going there, or you really got smashed one night and you can't really remember what had happened, but you know you're pretty cool and okay. You don't say it was a bit mad when you brutalised, raped and murdered people. It's just incredible to me that the first thought he had after committing mass murder was to get more drugs. It seems like after some point when he decided to take the drugs and he'd had yet another binge, that he decided that he needed to do something to himself. That's when it seems he stabs himself and then he calls his mother around 7 a.m. Now, this was clearly not a serious attempt on his life, because if it was, he'd be dead. If you know how to brutalise and kill people, you know how to do it to yourself. Take the knife, stab it through your heart, take the knife, cut your main artery in your leg or in your throat. If you don't know where it is, you can always Google it, right? This is a guy who's adept at scoring drugs. I'm sure it wouldn't be that difficult to do the same when it comes down to how to end himself. But he never wanted to end himself at all, because these kind of individuals, they tend not to have the courage to want to end their own lives. They're good at stealing others, but not their own. It takes a tremendous amount of courage, if I'm honest, to be somebody who can go through with ending a life. It's not that individuals who kill themselves are cowards, because most of us have got a hormone in our brain, GABA hormone, that actually stops us being able to do that in these circumstances. When you can overcome that, it says that there tends to be a sense of absolute devastation, desperation, a need to escape. And whilst this man needs to escape to some degree, his desire of self-centeredness and self-preservation usurps that requirement to end himself, and instead he knows that he's going to have to some degree face the music. Calling his mum is the step that he takes. I imagine that he's starting to have that slow coming to terms of actually what's going to occur next. There's no way he's going to get away with it, but he's also not got the capacity to actually end his own life. So he's in this limbo. He has to go one way or the other, either go on the run, and inevitably this is not a guy who's very clever, so it wouldn't take him very long to be apprehended, or he can get taken into custody. At least then he'll have somewhere to sleep. And of course, we all know that sometimes when you get taken into custody and admit your crimes early, well, that can change and challenge the punishment that you might get if you did do something like go on the run. So after he's got high, he's spoken to his mum, he's inflicted these wounds on himself, he goes to a shop, he buys himself some tobacco. This is at 7:23 a.m. and it's at this point that he calls the police. Now the CCTV actually captures him queuing up in the off licence, and he's calm. And as he pays for the tobacco, you can literally see blood on his hands. So he's walking around clearly drenched in blood. I can't imagine how the shopkeeper would have felt in that circumstance. Now, when he's taken into custody, he doesn't really have anywhere to go, does he? He's banged to rights, so of course he confesses to the offences. But as he confesses, of course he's saying, I'm not really responsible. You know, at the end of the day, I did these terrible things, these heinous things, but I was just psychologically impaired at the time. I didn't have a normal compos mentis judgment. So even though I'm guilty, am I actually really that guilty? Yes, you are guilty. You are so guilty that if there was to define guilt, there'd be a picture of you framed in the dictionary. But anyway, this is what he's saying. I'm psychologically impaired. So he actually goes ahead and says, I did kill them, but it's manslaughter. So he denies murder. I mean, I have no idea where he ever thought he was going to go with this line of defence. Mass murder and rape, and yet apparently it's manslaughter. Absolutely ludicrous. So he goes down this road of saying, listen, I have any recollections of the killings, my actions that I carried out, they're actually to do with a brain injury that I suffered years earlier. And so he's painting this picture of, well, yeah, I killed them, but there's a reason for killing. I had a brain injury, so that's the reason that this played out, which is absolute BS. And I don't know whether he thought that they were going to be like, oh, okay, That makes really a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that Bendall's one of those people who's had a head injury. And you know what head injuries do? I mean, every time somebody hits their head, they're out murdering people, aren't they? They're like, we're going to look at your history. So, of course, they do historical tests and they do extensive neurological tests. And they conclude this is not the case. Because, of course, Bendall is a huge pathological liar. Simple as. So then we get to court, and court occurred a few weeks ago, 21st of December 2022. It's heard in Derby, so at the Crown Court in Derby. Now, bear in mind, this guy's tried to say it's the neurological issues that I've got that caused this, and he wanted, clearly, to have some kind of defence in that level. But there is no medical defence. They've done all these tests. And because of that, because he tried to create and mask the reality of his actions, he has to plead guilty to 4 counts of murder and, of course, 1 count of rape. Now, when the judge handed down the sentence in this case, wow, it was so appropriate. It was so well done, because they actually gave a sentence of 5 life sentences. They basically represented each of the crimes, the murders, the rape, etc. And that's important to all the extended family of those victims, to hear that every one of the crimes was given such a diligent and long and lengthy sentence. It's powerful. Psychologically, it says good. They had validity and value in this world, and that's been stolen. Their lives are no more, and therefore his life will be taken as far as we can take it in the UK. He's been given a whole life order. That man will never be released from prison. He'll never be free. There'll never be a parole hearing. He'll never walk our streets again, whether he's 99. It's not happening. He'll take his last breath, hopefully painfully, very painfully, in prison after a very harsh experience of many years inside. I hope as he gets older and frailer, that so too is he punished more and more. Because in prison they really don't like women killers, and they certainly do not like child rapists and killers. He actually did agree with his barrister beforehand that he should indeed receive a full life sentence. I don't think for 1 minute that's humility. I don't feel 1 minute that's remorse. All I really think that is an acceptance that it's inevitable. There was no other term that you could expect. Now, Judge Mr. Justice Sweeney, he stated that Lacey's murder alone would have warranted full life terms. So therefore, even if he had murdered and raped that poor child, he would have gone down as far as Mr. Justice Sweeney was concerned and never walked our streets again. And for that judge, he found it just incomprehensible that he was also dealing with this man who'd killed 3 children and a pregnant woman. And therefore, there was an absolute unavoidable level to the sentence. It was always going to be that way. And this is what the judge said. I have no doubt whatsoever, based on the facts of your case, considered as a whole, that punishment requires you being kept in prison for the rest of your life. And I think we can all say amen to that. Now, during the hearing, as victims' families stared at the man who had destroyed their lives, Bendall just stared at the floor the whole time. He showed absolutely no emotion. Coward. Because at times in these cases, where families read impact statements or where they express themselves in the court, you'll see these individuals who are being sent down for the crimes actually feel emotional, a recognition, a registration of what have I done? Destroying my own life, destroying these people's lives, but not him. And he didn't even try to connect with that reality, just a disassociation. I imagine as far as Bendall is concerned, he's imagined somewhere in his small brain that really he isn't that responsible. Now, Bendall is imprisoned in one of my favourite places, HMP Wakefield, aka Monster Mansion. And the reason it's called Monster Mansion, it is housed some really heinous humans. It's a high security prison, and some of the most notorious and nasty criminals have been stored there, shall we say. That includes Mick Philpott, One of the first videos I did on YouTube, also done a couple of documentaries on him. What a horrible excuse for a man. Ian Watkins, I will do that case. Heinous child molester, never ever should be allowed to walk our streets again. Ian Huntley, the Soham murders of Holly and Jessica. Again, the most heinous type of individual. And Robert Maudsley, an individual who has been stored essentially alone and segregated from other prisoners because of his attacks on inmates. So we're talking about a really horrible place to end up. Now in court, the victim impact statement of Jason, who was of course John Paul's and Lacey's father, was read out. Can you imagine how heartbreaking it is for this individual? His children have been murdered. He must go to bed knowing each night what happened in those final moments of Lacey's life, how they fought to survive. It's just too terrible to imagine. I find it really difficult to even visualise and try to place myself in an empathetic position because it's so soul destroying to imagine, let alone to live. Jason said this: as well as taking 4 lives, he's taken my life too. I no longer have a future. Life is empty. All I feel is sadness. The love I crave is from my beautiful kids. I can't have it. It's a hole that can never be filled. I can't kiss them. I can't tell them I love them and get an answer back. I feel broken. I feel I'll never get to hug them, squeeze them tight. I'd give anything just to speak with them and say goodnight, my beautiful. I lived and worked and did the things I did for them. Now I have nothing to fight for. I'm lost without them. All I have is that each day that passes is a day that I get closer to my babies. I used to be scared of dying because I feared I'd miss out on loving and holding John and Lacey and seeing what they're doing in life. I wanted to be a part of it all forever. Now I don't fear death. I'm not scared at all. I just want the pain I feel to end. It's such a cross to bear for that father. And also I just want to highlight that I think we should talk about this murder of 5 because Terry was pregnant and that child had meaning, even if that meaning was simply to Terry. Terry's mother, Angela Smith, she said this in her statement: how could Bendel commit such horrific acts of violence against a woman and 3 defenseless children who posed no threat or harm towards him? The way they died haunts me every day. Their kids would say, I'm scared of monsters. I told them there's no such thing as monsters. How wrong I was. Terry was my only child. I will never have any other children or grandchildren. They were the most precious things in my life. Again, what we're talking about here is the stealing of futures, the absolute destruction of families. He gets to live his life in prison. He gets to eat 3 meals a day. He gets to exercise. He gets to learn. He gets to do creative activities. He gets to do all of those things. Whilst the family of Terry and her children and Con, they all lose their future because of this. I know people make legacy. I know that people who've had children who've been murdered create the most incredible organisations, but it comes from a place of pain. And it will always come from a place of pain. There's no remedying it. There's no righting it. There's no getting over it. There's just surviving it. And not everyone survives these things. We've talked about that time and time again, where the pain becomes so enormous that the only viable option is to exit. It's a terrible, terrible burden for these loving individuals to carry. Also, Angela recalled actually going and visiting her daughter at the chapel arrest. It's incredibly brave of her. The funeral director warned her against going and looking at her beautiful daughter. They said she's deteriorated really badly, but Angela said, I want to see her. And I get that, because that's her baby. That's her girl. And no amount of deterioration is going to stop her skin being her skin and her hair feeling like her hair. She's still hers. Now, after viewing Terry, she actually said to the funeral director that she wanted him to close the coffin. She didn't want anyone else to see her, because she said that her daughter had gone from being this vibrant, beautiful, lovely 35-year-old woman to looking like someone in their 90s. And she said that that's an image that is going to remain with her for the rest of her life. Having noted that, I also think that it was probably highly important for her to go and be with her child. Yes, the lasting trauma of seeing the image is incredibly painful. It's an indelible stain on her conscience, but it was also her moment to say goodbye with her child, and he didn't get to steal that from her. Now also we've got to think about Connie, that little girl who was just staying at her friend's, that little girl who'd spent the afternoon raising money for people less fortunate than her, a little girl with a huge, whole, loved future ahead of her, just in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong monster. Connie's father, Charlie Gent, said this: "The murder of my daughter has completely torn my life apart. I feel totally lost and numb through the pain and distress that it's caused me. I feel I've become a lost soul trying to navigate my way through life without her here. I feel like part of my identity has been taken. I feel like I don't know who I am or what my purpose is in life anymore. My heart is totally broken and shattered into pieces, and no sentence will ever be sufficient justice for Connie's death. The man who did this can only be described as truly evil and should never be free from incarceration." Amen to that. Amen to that. Connie's father's absolutely right. He should never and will never be free from incarceration. And I know we all have different beliefs, and I'm just expressing mine here. But I genuinely think you answer for your actions when you die. I genuinely do. And I think that when this man answers for his, he's going to be burning hot and bright for millennia, for eternity. And I genuinely feel that that will be validated when he dies, and deservingly so, because he should not have a moment of peace, not a moment. Now, since these absolutely horrific killings, they've actually decided that they're going to demolish the property, and I think that is really important, because that is a house of horrors and nobody wants that blight on the landscape. We should not concentrate and fixate on the deaths of those beautiful babies, the deaths of Terry or Connie. We should concentrate on the love that they had, the absolute enormity of love felt for them. They have more meaning in each of their little fingers than the man we've talked about today has in his entire body, in his entire history. They have infinite meaning still to this world. So the council demolishing that building is a fitting way, it's a fitting tribute. It says we will not focus on the deaths because their lives were so much more important. And they're actually getting a fitting memorial that's going to be planned in that place. So, of course, it means that people will remember the children and Terry and not focus on the heinous, macabre, disastrous deaths and murders of this family and of the friend of this family. Now, I said at the very beginning that there was also an investigation into the probation service's involvement with Bendel, because we look for missed opportunities. How often do I say that in this channel? Missed opportunities. And again, here I am. Because it transpires that a terrible, tragic error had been made. And I'll tell you why. Because the man whose history I listed before, who's clearly high risk, he'd been incorrectly categorised as medium risk. Now, the very fact that he had substantial violence in his background meant that he should obviously have been categorised as high risk. And bear in mind, his latest conviction for arson, I mean, these are all high risk issues, but the probation officer had classed him as medium risk. That's unbelievable. Because that meant when it went to court, the judge who was dealing with the case chose not to impose a custodial sentence. Instead, they gave him, after all those years inside for violent offences, a 2-year suspended sentence and allowed him to reside in Terry's home. Now, the condition was that he had to wear the electronic tag and he had to regularly meet his probation officer, who was a trainee. Now, please don't get me wrong, that probation officer has to live with this reality. And as a trainee, they should be being overseen and supervised. I'm not going to lay the blame at a trainee's feet. But what are we doing with offenders like this being dealt with by a trainee who's not clearly being supervised how they should be? And when the judge actually passed that sentence down, that pathetic excuse for a sentence, when we're talking about a man so violent in the past that he's been in and out of prison, where he's created a situation of arson, and yet this guy's getting a suspended sentence and an electronic tag and being sent to live with a woman and kids, the judge was so convinced that it was the right sentence that he even went so far to say he never believed that Bendel would offend again. Just going to throw it out there. Was the judge Mystic Meg? No, the judge wasn't Mystic Meg. Could the judge read the future? Don't think that's the case. Why would a judge in any universe believe that they knew so much about an offender who had been repeatedly aggressive and violent, who had literally been in and out of prison because of these violent offences? How on earth does that judge then believe that some miracle has happened and this guy isn't going to offend again? That's how confident and superior and arrogant this particular judge was. There's such a pompousness to that. I mean, just go down the street and ask random people, shopkeepers, fishmongers, people who fit your electrics, do you think that this guy is somebody who might reoffend again? Well, he's reoffended quite a lot. I think I'm going to go with a yes. Do you want to be a judge? Oh, I could probably do a better job than most of them. I despair. I despair. But this is what happened. Now, bear in mind that's catastrophic for the case that we're talking about today. It really is catastrophic. Now, going back to the actual probation officer, that probation officer was later subsequently dismissed. They were found to be guilty of gross misconduct. Like I said, I think there's just a massive failure in supervision per se in those scenarios, and for that probation officer to live the rest of their life potentially feeling highly responsible for the deaths of these individuals. Obviously, they're not personally responsible, but feeling like you're a contributor, that will be very difficult to manage. I wonder what the judge felt like. Just throwing it out there. Because if ever you could have got it wrong, it's demonstrated in the, oh, they'll never offend again, to an act of mass murder. They let him go back to live with Terry and kids, a man with so much history and form that he shouldn't have been within a stone's throw of a woman or a child. Now, frustratingly, Bendel's never actually given a motive for his actions. Sometimes I think there should be a law where you don't get fed unless you are able to describe why you at least believe you carried out your actions. But whilst he was in custody, what he said to the authorities was, there was no motivation, I'd just been on a cocaine binge. No, that's bullshit. And I'll tell you why. You'd been on a lot of cocaine binges. You hadn't gone around murdering people. You hadn't committed mass murder any other time. That's not true. And I'll tell you why I don't think it's true. This is my own personal belief system. I think his target was always 11-year-old Lacey. Genuinely. I feel he had a fascination with her sexually. I feel like that's his main target. She was the one who was raped more than once. She was the one he took time with. She was the one he positioned the mirror for so he could watch himself doing that. That's not a cocaine binge. That's child molestation and murder. Now, he very readily, as I told you earlier on, admitted murdering his 4 victims, but he was not very quick to admit the rape. In fact, he didn't want to talk about the fact that he raped that child when she was literally dying and then after she was dead. And the rape charge, therefore, was only actually dealt with after they did the autopsy. because they were able to identify that Lacey had suffered a really serious sexual assault. And it concerns me because I don't know whether he was grooming her before that. I hope to God that had never happened, but I genuinely believe that he had a malevolent connection to her. And another reason why I think it was Lacey that he was fixating on is because of the amount of distance that he tries to put between his actions and reality. So whilst he's in custody, he speaks to a prison officer, and he actually tells that prison officer that the reason that he moved Lacey's body was because he wanted her to be near her mother. Now, the truth was, he'd moved her to the bedroom so he could rape her multiple times. But that's not the story he's telling. Now, whilst Bendel had actually been violent in the past, one of the things that we can say is it had never actually been directed, as far as we know, criminally, towards women or children. And people also say, who knew him, and the reports seem to suggest that until the point that we've talked about today, he'd never apparently shown any sexual interest in children. I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. You don't suddenly develop an interest in a child when you're murdering them. It's within you. He's a predatory paedophile as far as I'm concerned, and child murderer. When he finally was given the chance of having a happy, content life with this absolutely wonderful, accepting family, suddenly his offending behaviour escalates that rapidly. It's unbelievable to me. I think he found a perfect opportunity and played out his warped desires. Thankfully, Bendel, a mass murderer, paedophile, rapist, and necrophile, let's call him as he is, thankfully he'll die in prison. Hopefully in a similar way he subjected his victims to, maybe. I find it so heartbreaking and so frustrating that yet again I'm talking about the failures of a service, in this case the probation service, when it comes to the loss of 4 completely innocent lives. They allowed a violent, aggressive predator to infect the homes of a really beautiful family. And he stole 4 lives, 3 of which had only literally just begun, as well as the life of an unborn child. And subsequently, because of his actions, he destroyed so many others' lives because of the ripple effect. I wish nothing but pain on this human being. And I feel no guilt in stating that. 4 incredible lives destroyed by one monster. I hope, like me, you feel that at least when it comes down to the fact that we don't have the death penalty in the UK, the correct level, sentence-wise, was given to this man. Whether we'll ever find out what motivated him, who knows? But what I truly believe is that he always had a macabre, malevolent and dark interest in children, as well as a dark interest in controlling and manipulating and destroying others. And now, fortunately, he's destroyed his own life. Let me know your thoughts, let me know your feelings, and I'd just like you all to join in me in acknowledging the devastating loss to the family who lost these incredible human beings and these children who deserve so much more. So we're going to dedicate this video to them. Take care, guys. Be safe.